You may or may not be aware of the fact that the Church, in giving her directives for the delivery of the homily, says that the homily can be derived from one of two different sources. One is the scriptures of the day, and that's what we normally do when we preach. We preach on the scriptures of the day. The second source the Church permits us to preach from is from the prayers of the Mass. So the prayers that we hear every week in the Mass can be a source for the homily. And that's the source I'd like to draw from today. The reason why our church permits this is because all of the prayers of the Mass are basically taken from the Bible as well. So whether we're preaching on the scriptures of the day or on the Mass text, we're preaching from the Bible. The word that I want to focus in on today is one that comes up often in the Mass, and that is the word sacrifice. In a few moments, I'm going to be at the altar and I'm going to say these words to you. Pray, brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father. So deep in our Catholic tradition is the understanding that what we're doing here today as we come to celebrate Mass is sacrifice. That the Mass is a sacrifice, that the priest offers sacrifice, or rather, Christ the priest, through the ordained priest, offers sacrifice, and that you too, who are gathered here, offer sacrifice. So I want to meditate with you on what that means and what its implication is for our lives. In order to do that, it's helpful perhaps to go back to a little bit of our ancestry, to our Jewish forebears, and to get a little bit of a sense of what they understood about sacrifice, because we have built upon it. As you know, the earliest Christians were converted Jews, and they had a rich, rich tradition of sacrifice, bringing their animals, like their oxen or their lambs or their bulls, to the temple and placing them in the hands of the priests who would sacrifice them at the altar. They would have the understanding that this was what God had asked of them. As they reflected on their previous experience of going into the temple, and now having come to know Jesus, and reflected on what he did on the cross, they came to a fascinating conclusion. And that is, what Jesus did on the cross had all of the characteristics of what they used to do in the temple when they brought their animals for sacrifice. How did they make that connection? Because what Jesus did on the cross just looked like a Roman execution. How did they connect that with sacrifice in the temple? Well, it came from their very simple understanding of what a sacrifice was. A sacrifice was you bringing a gift to God, and out of love for God, and out of a desire for union with God, offering it to him. So love was always at the core of sacrifice. In fact, we can substitute the word love and sacrifice interchangeably. They're both the same thing, but sacrifice is love being offered in a different context. What they also understood was when they came to the temple and brought their lamb or their bull or their goat or whatever, that the offering of that animal was a symbol. It was a symbol of the offering of their very lives over to God. And so when they looked at what Jesus did on the cross, they came to the awareness that what Jesus was doing on the cross was making an offering of himself over to his Father out of love. And so they recognized that what Jesus did on the cross deserved the title as well, sacrifice. Only it was now a perfect sacrifice. What they did in the temple was less than perfect because it was made by sinners. But what Jesus offered was the perfectly pleasing sacrifice to God. What the Jews also clearly understood was that God never needed their sacrifices. And this comes out as a constant theme in the Old Testament. God telling his people, I don't need your sacrifices. Don't think for 1 minute that I need your sacrifices in order to improve my life or even to love you. I'm going to love you whether you offer sacrifice or not because I am love. So it was never an issue of God needing their sacrifice. It was always they needed to offer sacrifice. Why? Because they understood what had happened to all of us in the fall. What happened in the fall of the human race was the whole human race turned away from God, refused to love God, and in the beautiful expression of St. Augustine, we became curved in on ourselves, focused in on ourselves, our own desires, etc. So God had to find a way to draw us out of our self-preoccupation. And he came up with a brilliant solution, and that was sacrifice. He began it with our Old Testament ancestors, but it continues in our own day where sacrifice remains at the center of our lives. Because what's at the center of our lives is the Eucharist, and the Eucharist is, in its essence, a sacrifice. So a sacrifice is a kind of an undoing of that self-centeredness that resulted from the fall. It's an untwisting of the twisted human heart, whereby we come before God, and instead of focusing in on ourselves, we give of ourselves. We reach out beyond ourselves and give to God the gift of ourselves. So if sacrifice is simply a gift given to God out of love, it's easy for us to see how what Jesus did on the cross is a sacrifice. But what I said earlier is that the Mass itself is a sacrifice. How is that? Well, it comes from our understanding of what is made present at the Mass. What we believe becomes present at the Mass is the very person of Jesus himself, as he is right now, risen in glory at the right hand of the Father. But because we can't separate the person of Jesus himself from all his experiences, all that went into making up who he was, from the moment of his conception to the moment of his death, and even after his ascending to the Father, because we can't separate the person of Christ from all that he experienced, what we can say rightly is that in the Eucharist, what becomes present to us is the person of Christ, but also the event of Christ, everything that went into making up who he was. Now, the church has focused in on that one moment in the event of Christ's life, whereby everything came to a culmination, and that was on the moment of the cross. His whole life was a sacrifice, an offering to his Father, but it all came to a perfect culmination on the cross, where we saw most perfectly how deeply he had given himself over to his Father in sacrifice. So the cross is made present in the Mass, the sacrifice of the cross, and therefore the Mass itself is a sacrifice. Okay, one final step. A few moments ago, I said that not only is what Jesus did on the cross a sacrifice, not only is the Mass a sacrifice because his cross is made present, but I said that you make sacrifice here. Brothers and sisters, pray that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Almighty Father. How is that? Well, it comes from our understanding of the teaching of the Bible that in order for us to be in union with God, something dramatic has to happen in our lives. And it's this: that in order for us to be in union with God, somehow what happened on the cross for Jesus has to happen for us. Doesn't mean we have to be physically crucified, but that his complete and total self-offering to the Father on the cross has to be replicated. It has to be reproduced in our lives, because he's the one who's in full union with God. If we're going to be in union with God, somehow our lives have to imitate his. The church has always seen that the Eucharist is the primary place where that takes place, where there is a joining of our lives with that of what Jesus did on the cross, because it is made present in our midst. So that's how we offer sacrifice. We come here and we participate in the Mass, which is a sacrifice, and we join ourselves consciously and deliberately to Jesus' sacrifice. And that's what makes our participation here a sacrifice. So there's only one way back to God, and it is by participating in Jesus' cross, by offering sacrifice. So if somebody asked you, what did you do between 11:15 and 12:15 this morning? You would say, I came to the church in Mount Carmel and I offered sacrifice. I offered the sacrifice of my life in union with Jesus on the cross, which was made present in the Mass for me. And you would be perfectly accurate in saying that. How do we do that concretely? Well, if we're here and we're participating well in the Mass, the whole Mass is sacrifice on one level. If we're participating well, then we are participating in sacrifice. What I find helpful, just personally, in my own personal spirituality, in order to connect with the idea of sacrifice, I'm going to share what I do at every Mass and just leave it with you for your own reflection. At every Mass, what I do after communion, when we're in our quiet time, with the recognition that Jesus is now dwelling within me, Jesus in his sacrifice, in his self-offering to the Father, is now dwelling with me even in my body. I take a moment and I speak to each of the members of the Trinity. And I say to Jesus, Jesus, I join myself to your sacrifice, which is offered to the Father and is present within me right now. Then I speak to the Holy Spirit and I say, Holy Spirit, draw me into Jesus' great love of his Father on the cross. And it's the role of the Holy Spirit to draw us into the cross. And then I speak to the Father and I say, Father, I offer you everything that I am and everything that I have to the glory of your name. I find that's a way of helping me to just remind myself that what I'm all about here, why I'm here, is to offer sacrifice, and to offer the sacrifice of the Mass. So I leave that with you for reflection and just simply invite you in joining me in thanking God for the great gift that we have every Sunday, some of us every day if we celebrate daily Mass, of coming to participate in this great event called the sacrifice of the Mass, by which we find our way back to God, find our way into holiness through joining ourselves to Jesus.